Modules 10 and 11, possessive apostrophes. Let's define an apostrophe. An apostrophe is a punctuation mark that looks like 1/2 of a quotation mark. When do we use apostrophes? There are two uses of an apostrophe. First, for contractions. For example, would not. The two words would not can be contracted into one word using an apostrophe, wouldn't. This use of apostrophes is looked at in another video in this series. The other use of an apostrophe is to indicate possession. That's what we're going to be looking at in this video. A couple notes. First, never use an apostrophe with a verb. For example, the boy visits his friend. Here, this is not a contraction, and there's no possession. So therefore, an apostrophe should not be used. Also, never use an apostrophe for plural forms of nouns where no possession exists. For example, the girls played hockey. Again, incorrect. There's no contraction here, and there's no possession. Therefore, the use of an apostrophe is incorrect. Let's look at rule number 1. How do we begin to use apostrophes? Well, the first thing we must do is determine if a possessive apostrophe is even required. In other words, does possession exist in a sentence? Okay? What we have to do is perform what I call an of test. Okay? In an of test, what we do is, let's take an example, John's bike. To see if this is a correct use of an apostrophe, reverse the owner word and the item being owned and place the preposition of between them, just to see if it says the same thing. So, the bike of John. Yes, this is the of test. The bike of John says the same thing as John's bike. So yes, possession does exist. So an apostrophe as to indicate possession is necessary. Let's look at some examples. All we're looking at here is whether or not possession exists. Okay? The table's surface is green. Let's see if an apostrophe S is necessary here to indicate possession. Okay? Reverse the possessor or the owner and the item being possessed. Reverse these two terms and put the preposition of between them. So the surface of the table is green. This reworded statement is saying exactly the same thing as the original statement. So the possessive apostrophe is required to indicate possession. Let's look at another example. That house is my uncle's. Okay? What is actually being said here is that house is my uncle's house. Okay? This is an abbreviated form in this sentence. So let's see if the apostrophe S here is necessary. Okay? Does possession exist? So let's reverse the owner, the uncle, and the item being owned, the house. Let's reverse these two terms and put a preposition of between them. That house of my uncle. Yes, that reworded statement, the of test, is saying exactly the same thing as that house is my uncle's, or that house is my uncle's house. Therefore, an apostrophe S is necessary. Possession does exist. Let's look at an example here where possession does not exist. Or, in other words, an apostrophe is not necessary. Okay? That house belongs to my uncle. All right. Now, here, possession does exist, but an apostrophe S is not required. We know this when we can determine this if we do an of test. Let's reverse the house, which presumably here is the owner, and the uncle is presumably the item being owned. So the uncle of my house. Well, that's not saying the same thing as that house belongs to my uncle. Okay? So an apostrophe S is not required in this original statement. So this is correct. That house belongs to my uncle does not need an apostrophe S. All right. Rule number 2. Once we determine that possession does indeed exist and that we need an apostrophe S or some sort of apostrophe to indicate possession, okay, because the of test has been passed, this is what we do. Let's look at rule number 2, possessor words not ending in the letter S. Okay? If an apostrophe is necessary to indicate possession, we have to decide how to use the apostrophe to indicate possession properly. If the possessor word ends in any letter other than S, simply add an apostrophe S at the end of the possessor word, the owner. Let's look at an example. The friends of the boy, okay? The owner is boy, and the friends is the item being owned, okay? So boy and friend. Possession does exist, so let's add an apostrophe S, and let's look at the last letter of the owner word or the possessor word. It is not an S. Therefore, just leave the apostrophe S as is. Boy's friend is correct. Let's look at this. The school of the children. Children is the owner or the possessor. School is the item being owned or possessed. Again, possession does exist. It passes the of test. So we add an apostrophe S and look at the last letter of the owner word. In this case, it is an N, not an S. So we just leave apostrophe S as is. Children's school is correct. Okay, what happens though if the possessor word ends in the letter S? Okay, now what we have to do is perform what is called a sound test to determine if we use an apostrophe S to indicate possession or simply an apostrophe. Okay, let's look at some examples. Here in these examples, we use an apostrophe and an S. We use an apostrophe S to indicate possession. The pen of Ross. So we have Ross as the owner, and pen is the item being owned. Okay, we have possession, okay, because the sound test has determined that. Sorry, the of test has determined that. So we put an apostrophe S and look at the last letter of the owner word. In this case, the last letter is an S. That tells us, we have to think about it. We have to do a sound test to determine if we use an apostrophe S or simply an apostrophe. Okay. Do we say Ross's pen, where we actually hear the extra S, or do we say Ross pen? No, we actually hear the extra S, so it is Ross's pen, so the apostrophe S is correct. The same with the jacket of Les. Les, and the item being owned is jacket. We know it passes the of test. We know we have possession, so we add an apostrophe S. We look at the last letter of the owner word. It's an S. That means we have to perform a sound test. Do we say Les's jacket? And we hear the extra S, or do we say Les jacket? No, we hear the extra S. So we actually hear Les's jacket. We hear the extra zus sound. And let's look at the daughter of my boss. So we have boss and daughter. Again, we have possession. The of test indicates that. Add an apostrophe S. Look at the last letter. It's an S. Therefore, we have to perform the sound test. Do we hear the extra zus here? The boss's daughter? Is that correct, or is it boss daughter? No. When it's pronounced correctly, okay, it's not boss daughter, it's boss's daughter. Now, this is technically correct, what I've shown you. Be careful, though. it is accepted in English. Even though it's not technically correct, it is accepted to, and this is not to confuse you, I just want you to know that it is accepted to drop the S. It's not technically correct, but it is accepted that this is saying, this is pronounced Ross's pen, even though the extra S is not in there. Okay, I don't want you to confuse you, but it is important to recognize that that extra S, even though it's pronounced, is often dropped. Now let's look at some examples where we don't need the apostrophe S. In fact, to use an apostrophe S would be incorrect. We simply use an apostrophe to indicate possession. So let's look at two examples. The first example, the boss of my parents. So parents is the owner here, or the possessor, and boss is the item being possessed. We know we have possession because of the of test. Therefore, we put an apostrophe S at the end of the owner word. We look at the last letter of the owner word. It's an S. Do we pronounce this as the parents' boss, where we hear the extra S, or do we pronounce it as the parents' boss? Well, this is not correct. We don't say the parents' boss, we say the parents' boss. We don't hear the extra zus. Okay? So simply put an apostrophe. Okay? The bikes of my sons. Sons are the owner, and bikes is the items being owned. We do have possession. Add an apostrophe S. Look at the last letter of the owner word. It's an S, so that means we have to perform a sound test. Do we say the sons' bikes, where we hear the extra S, or the sons' bikes, where we don't hear the extra S? Well, this one is correct. The sons' bikes is incorrect. So in these two cases, we only need an apostrophe to indicate possession.